I'm Philip Wooster. I was the third generation of Haywood and Wooster. I trained for 5 years in London and Bristol before joining the firm in 1959, and was with them until the company assets were sold off in 1972. When I was still at school, my father, Mr. Clem Wooster, and Mr. Robert Blackmore were joint managing directors of the company. My father regrettably died in 1953, and from then on Mr. Robert Blackmore was the managing director of the company until the 60s, when he became company chairman. When the work started, I was still at school and my father was alive, and although he personally was not looking after the work being carried out at the Abbey, that was being done by Mr. Robert Blackmore, I did, as a comparatively young schoolboy, can remember going up in the roofs and seeing the last of the treatment work which was done at the end of the 1940s, prior to the stonework, which I believe started about 1950. One of my memories of the furthest back was the first time when the tower went into steel scaffolding. I can remember first the considerable thought that was given as to whether the Abbey could take the weight of the steel scaffolding going up all the way round the tower, which was many tons. It all had to be worked out, and they had to decide whether the Abbey could take it. But I do remember when it was up, climbing all the way to the top on a particularly windy day, you could feel the tower distinctly moving backwards and forwards in the wind.
When you went up into the tower, did you see people working there on the outside?
Yes, on the scaffolding. We were starting doing the restoration. The first part was the tower. We did the tower first, and they worked down to that. The bankers' sheds were up on top of the chancel, and so the stone was pulled up that far, or hoisted that far, in block form mainly, or cut to overall sizes. And then the banker masons are the masons that do the carving on other blocks of stone to be very firm, and they just normally work the stone to the shape using, in those days, zinc metal templates to get which they copied off the old stonework, allowing for weathering, and then they carved the stone, and then the fixer masons usually cut out the old stonework and fixed the new in. It is interesting that we have the photographs of the men actually working the stone up on the banker's shed on top of the chancel roof. It was good thinking, because obviously the more you handle stone after it's been carved until you get it in the wall where it's going to be, the chances are you can damage it. And if you knocked it or knocked a piece off, if it couldn't be dowelled back again, it normally meant you had to start the whole job again.
Arthur Baring was the foreman, I believe. Can you tell us a little about him?
I got to know Arthur Baring particularly, and most years I would come down at least once. He was masonry foreman or job foreman right from the start of the masonry restoration at the end of the 40s, but he was a very approachable man. He knew stonework absolutely inside out, could converse with the architects completely on craftsman to architect level, and they worked very closely together, deciding on what stones had to be replaced and which could be left in. I do recall one day when, towards the end of my training at college, I discussed with Arthur where the stone was coming from, and he said he'd never been to the box quarries where the Hearth and Park stone was the general stone we used for the restoration of the general wall surfaces, and he had never been there. So I rather naughtily arranged to take him off from the work one afternoon and for him to go around the quarries where we saw the big coal cutters which they were using to cut the stonework out at Hartham Park, and he had a fascinating afternoon. I had been very naughty and not told Robert, because I thought he might not let us go, and so Arthur, I think, rather caught it in the neck for leaving his job without permission from Mr. Blackmore, and I was not in the flavour of the month, being only a mere student, for taking the man without asking permission.
Can you tell me a bit about Hartham Park stone? Can you tell us a bit about that stone? Why did they use it?
Well, box stone was the preferred hard weather stone from the Corsham quarries, but it was virtually worked out by the 1950s, and so they had moved over to the adjoining quarry of Hartham Park, which was nearly, the beds they were cutting there were nearly as good as the box ground, and in fact now they have announced in the last 12 months that the stone they're cutting now is as good a quality as the old box ground was.
I'm interested that you said that Arthur was able to talk to the architects. Can I ask you, when they replaced stones, or a decision was made to replace a stone, could the foreman make that decision on his own, or did he have to agree with the architects?
In really difficult, large things, Mr. Robert Blackmore and Mr. Breakspear, the architect, would have discussed them with Arthur Baring in attendance to get the general policy. But the day-to-day running was left in sessions when the architect came down and worked with Arthur probably for most of a day, and they would go over the next area to be worked and decide individually, using both their different types of skills and knowledge, to decide which stones could remain and which had to come out.
I have a question about the angels at the front of the abbey. How did they repair them? Do you know the process by any chance?
Well, this was where so much of the thinking and deliberation came, because at one time previous restorations had recarved the angels coming down the ladder as coming vertically downwards, head first. The decision was made in the end that the angels should, in the revised or the replaced ones, should be coming down the ladder looking over their shoulders. And so you can see a little where this does give you one of the signs of the different policies on the restoration of the front. Also, there were several fairly large items of stonework were carved by Peter Watts, which was done in his studio in our yard at Walcott Street, and these were replaced. There's a tree on the south side, and one or two other items of the angels that had to be placed. He did do all the carving, and the masons just fitted them in, cut out and fitted them on the actual west front.
So the angels were pre-carved and then just slotted into a spot. Oh, I wondered how that was done. Thank you very much. I've come away from this interview with a new respect for the masons and for Heywood and Wooster.